Today I'm working with my first slab. I made some mistakes, and I got a little cocky, but I made a bad coffee table, and I made a little money for charity.
Whoa, whoa. That's like a lot of wood.
That's what she said.
Another good one! You're on fire!
A little over a month ago, I found out my local animal care and control was having a fundraiser gala with a silent auction, and I thought maybe I can do something to help. I can't adopt another dog, but I can do something. I guess the only downfall is I'm gonna probably be helping cats, so I'll pretend they don't have any. After picking out one of my many maple slabs, waiting for my inspiration, I decided on a general size I wanted, and then I added about 2 inches to each side since I hadn't exactly decided what I wanted. At this point, all I knew was there was a table hiding somewhere in that slab. So, like a 15th century Italian sculptor, I made my first cut of what would be a masterpiece. Or at least something you can put in front of your love seat. So yeah, that first cut is pretty stupid. But let's pretend I did that on purpose so I could use this Japanese flush cut saw I recently bought on Amazon. One side is made for softer woods while the other side is for hardwoods. And the best part is, it only cost me 22 bucks. This isn't sponsored in any way, I just think it works great.
Okay, I trust myself anymore.
So while I was working, my youngest son decided he wanted to try to help. He never wants to help when I ask, so I wasn't going to tell him no, even on this new saw. I went over everything he needed to do off camera, but as you saw, it didn't go according to plan. It didn't mess anything up, but he refused to touch the saw again. We'll have to work on it later. Removing all the dead and decaying wood is one of the messier parts of the job. I'm not always 100% sure what can stay and what can go, so I tend to err on the side of caution and remove more than what might be needed. The slab wasn't too bad though, and the area in the center was the only part I had to dig out. You can't really see it right now, but it goes all the way through to the bottom. Just make sure you use your most expensive Harbor Freight chisels. Next, I move to the sides where there's a small amount of whatever it's called still on the live edge areas. Using a nylon wheel and my drill, it comes off pretty easy. These wheels do a good job, but they do not like heat. I've already had one wheel melt together, so it's pretty much useless now. The other side took a little bit longer to clear up, but I don't know, watching this later was a little satisfying. You can see there was a lot of spalting here on the wood. Spalting is caused by fungi or fungi, however you want to say it, colonizing itself in the tree. As the fungi extracts nutrients from the tree, it leaves behind dark lines and patterns. Basically, it's fungus poop. So when you're dealing with fungus poop, make sure you wear a mask. I'll be using some black epoxy to fill some voids, so I need to seal the area around it so the black dye doesn't stain the wood. But before I do, I use some compressed air and mineral spirits to clean any remaining dust out of the area. Make sure you let that wood dry before moving on to the epoxy. Speaking of epoxy, to seal the wood, I used Total Boat's penetrating epoxy. Although, if I was going to do it again, I would probably just use the same deep pour epoxy I'm using later. That way, I can just pour when it starts to harden instead of having to sand everything before the pour. Both ways work, but a chemical bond is always going to be stronger than a mechanical bond. At least that's how I feel. Anyway, you may have to come back several times and reapply the epoxy as the wood soaks it up. I mean, you can see how dry the wood looks even after applying this epoxy. I think I went back 5 or 6 times over the course of a couple hours just to reapply it. And now begins the worst idea I had during this build. I figured since I was going to do a small deep pour on the live edge, I only needed a partial form. I laid down a bead of caulk on the underside of that edge to put a stop to epoxy going any further. I figured this was going to save me wasting any epoxy and in the long run, money. The mold release I'm using here works great, and it's way cheaper than using a bunch of tape. After you spray down your melamine, wait a couple minutes, then wipe off the excess. Hot damn, I'm a genius! I can't believe how smart this partial mold idea is. Well, that's not laying flat against the wood. Okay, I'll just clamp it down. That should do the trick. Not a problem. And for good measure, I'll throw a little caulk on the ends here, and everything should go according to plan. You've probably guessed it by now, but this did not go according to plan. But we'll get to that in a moment. The rest of the form, however, worked beautifully. I added a bead of caulk to the underside of each side before securing it to the bottom of the mold. I ended up using a nail gun on the other side because it was quicker at the moment. It turned taking the mold apart into a hassle later on though. Plus, I don't always get the nails in straight where I want them to go. Some caulk on the outside of the form, and that should, in theory, keep the epoxy from leaking out. So how much epoxy do I actually need? Well, I'm going to have to do a little math. I'm not going to let the numbers scare me, and you shouldn't either. Just measure the width every 2 to 3 inches, add those numbers up, and divide it by the number of times you measure, and that will give you your average width. There's an equation you can use to figure the rest out, or you can just go the easy route and use a calculator online. I use the epoxy calculator Super Clear Epoxy has on their website. I'll add a link to it in the description. Now that we know how much epoxy we're going to need, it's mixing time. Here I'm using Super Clear Epoxy's deep pour, which is a 2-to-1 ratio. I'm only using a small amount at first, so if there are any leaks, I won't lose too much. In hindsight, I should have used the 24-hour deep pour at this point, but live and learn. This build consisted of a whole lot of learning. For this first pour, I'm going for a black underside, so I am using black trans tint. This seems to be the best way to go for black epoxy, and I've found a little goes a long way. And this is where my troubles began. As I said, I am pouring just enough to cover the bottom here, and my plan was to use a slightly opaque smoke colored epoxy for the final pour. I didn't want a see-through bottom look, but I wanted to see the live edge. Unbeknownst to me, there was a super tiny leak. Over the course of about 3 days, I had to do small pours until the epoxy finally hardened enough to close that mysterious hole. Again, the 24-hour deep pour would have been better. Once I was sure there was no more leak, I was able to do my bigger pour I did all that math for earlier. Here, you can see that I used a small amount of trans tint to color the epoxy, but not so much that I couldn't see through it. On these smaller pours to fill in holes and gaps, a good trick is to use some hot glue as an epoxy dam. It dries quickly, and I think it cleans up much easier. Second to leaks, this is the part people dread when they're working with epoxy. Did I do enough to make sure my mold peels off nice and easy? And I can tell you, my mold mostly went to plan. A few whacks the hammer and it peels away great. Look how well that came off. Here's where things get me a little worried. The side took a bit more encouragement, and I think part of the problem was the nails I used instead of screws. The nails did their job, but a little too well, and if I would have used screws, I think this part would have come off just as clean as the other sides. So this is one less piece of melamine I get to reuse for another project. I thought some shop sounds might be the way to go here, since this bottom pulled up nice and easy. So, what did I learn here? Don't be lazy. Make sure the bottom of your piece is flat before putting it in a mold like this. If I would have done a complete mold and pour, the wood being flat wouldn't have mattered. The epoxy would have filled in the gaps and everything would have been flat when it came out. This can be a way to go, but I would have used a lot more epoxy than I wanted to. And since I am sponsoring this video, I wasn't using any more epoxy than I needed to. Now we need to fill this hole again.
No, you're not. You're not rolling on the floor laughing.
That's what that means? I thought it meant really obscene fart laugh.
Yes, all the epoxy I poured in here leaked out. But after seeing the bottom, I could tell you there won't be any leaks this time. And my shipment of 24-hour deep pour arrived just in time. By using a faster curing epoxy, I'm able to get the smaller epoxy fills done that much faster. Waiting a week for each pour to dry just isn't in the cards. Especially with this build, I did a good amount of procrastinating before I started it. Now that the epoxy is dry, I can scrape up my hot glue dam with my best chisel. Now the real fun begins. The setup for this alone is a pain. I don't have the room for a dedicated flattening table, so I have to take it all down when I'm not using it. That said, it does a great job. I am just short, so I need the help of a push stick to get across the table. If you're curious, I got the wood parts and hardware for the sled from Lee Valley Tools. It's fairly inexpensive and works nice. If you have the room for a dedicated flattening table and don't want to spend hundreds of dollars on something like woodpecker cells, I recommend it. If you're in my situation, you might be better off just making a small flattening sled for yourself. To keep the slab from moving, I use my normal hot glue trick to keep the slab down. I will also use popsicle sticks or tongue depressors to fill any gaps there might be, so there is zero chance of movement. If you decide to use this or something similar, it's important not to put any kind of weight or downward force on the router. Even the slightest downward pressure could mess with your flattening. Now it's everyone's favorite part of woodworking, sanding. But don't forget to water pop the grain before each new grit. To start, I used 80 grit to get out any of those pesky router marks and worked my way through 120, 150, and stopping at 180 grit. When you're sanding, you don't need to add any downward pressure. I know when I first started woodworking, I would do this because I was able to sand the wood faster. Turns out, I was just using shitty sandpaper. Do yourself a favor. Get some good sandpaper. If you're not sure what to get, Cat's Moses has a great YouTube video on it. When I'm sanding, I like to move in an up and down, left to right motion like these arrows are showing you, so I can get a nice even finish. For me, it is a surefire way to get rid of those whorl marks. Now you don't really need a track saw to do this. I went years without one. It just makes your life a little bit easier. I never really saw the point of spending that much money on something I might use maybe a couple times a year. Now that I turned a hobby my wife used for her personal needs into a business, I was able to justify the expense. Now that I have one, I would never go without one again. Now, remember at the beginning when I talked about being cocky? Well, here we go in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that happened. Don't get cocky and or lazy when you're working with tools. You're gonna mess something up. Just like my other cuts, I should have took a few small passes. Instead, I thought the 75 is more powerful than the 55. Maybe I can do this in just one cut instead of a whole bunch. Obviously, I was way wrong. I didn't even get to plunge the entire blade down before it kicked back. So learn from me. Do as I say and not as I just did. Good thing I'm building this to what I want instead of some specific dimensions from a client. I only had a range in mind for this, so it wasn't a big deal being forced to cut a little bit more off. It just meant a little less live edge. Now comes the tedious job of filling in a bunch of tiny bug holes that never seem to end. To do this, I use Super Clear's tabletop epoxy. It hardens pretty fast, so I can come back the next day and sand it down. Now, of course, after sanding, more holes popped up. This is usually in the epoxy due to an air pocket or two. For these small holes, I just use Starbond's black CA glue and activator so it hardens fast. And then I sand again. After what feels like hours of filling more holes and sanding, because it was, I can move on to the next step. To keep the tabletop flat, I'm adding some C-channels. You can make your own or buy them. I choose to save myself some time and buy them. They're really not that expensive anyway. I found some I liked on Etsy with a store named Maida Inc. I don't know if that's how you say it, but I'll put a link to a store at the bottom. Because I ordered my channels a bit too long, I had to cut them down with an angle grinder. Of course, I didn't record that part, and I missed some good footage of the cutting disc exploding on me. 2 words, I Pro. If you can't tell from the photo, that is a piece of disc that's stuck in the garage door. It could have been much worse. After cutting the groove for the C-channels, I got to work on the legs so they can be set in the wood as well. When you're doing this, think,
You should probably slow down because slow is smooth, smooth is fast.
I learned this from a drill sergeant once. I just wish I would have thought of a shirt before John did. Oh well, guess I'm gonna have to go buy one. So make sure your router is set to a lower RPM. The lower the RPM, the better control you're going to have. And seeing as I decided to freehand this thing, I needed all the control I could get. Then I went ahead and squared up each corner using my Nerich chisels. The corner chisel you see me using is actually quite nice. I need to sharpen the other one, I just haven't been in the mood to do it. I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't sure I was gonna have this good of a fit. Make sure it's not a tight fit though. We need some room for wood movement. Nobody wants cracks in their nice wood furniture. The first wood table I ever made was a farmhouse table made out of the best wood you could find from the Home Depot, or it might have been Lowe's. Straight pine 2x6s I spent almost an hour trying to find. I thought I was hot stuff after it was done, and for the style it was pretty good. We actually still have it, but it's been about 7 or 8 years and the boards have separated from each other a little. I definitely did not account for any wood movement when I was attaching the legs with huge lag bolts. I followed a YouTube DIYer doing his table and that was it. Then I went back and carved out the area where the C-channels will sit so they sit flush with the bottom. Watching this reminds me, I need a new router with some actual dust collection. This Craftsman has an attachment, but my hose doesn't fit it, and to be honest, I can't see a thing with the attachment on. So in the comments, what would you pick for a new router? Just like a lot of other woodworkers, I like threaded inserts. They're easy to use, easy to install, and allows you to remove the screws over and over should you want to take the furniture apart later. Just be careful not to go through your table when you're drilling. I keep saying I'm going to get a larger depth stop, but I never do, and I keep going back to my trusty painter's tape. Once all the holes are drilled, I like to come back with a countersink bit. This will help your threaded insert fit just below the surface of the wood. When screwing the inserts in, I like to add a little CA glue. Some use wood glue, some use epoxy, some use nothing. I don't know if one is better over the other or if I need anything at all for that matter. What do you think? Of course, I'm using the least efficient tool for these inserts, the Allen wrench that came with them. I wanted just a slight round over on the edges, so with my DeWalt palm router, I went around all the edges with an 1/8 inch round over white side bit. At least I think that was the size. I just know I've used it many times and like it. White side is pretty much all I use now. I usually go to Bits and Bits, find the bit I want, then I go search it on Amazon so I'm not paying for shipping. It's rare I spend enough in one transaction with Bits and Bits to get free shipping. Don't mind a couple of those crappy angles. I thought they were going to be awesome when I hit the record button. Using 180 grit sandpaper and a thick sanding pad, I went back around every edge and side and make sure to lower my sander speed so there is less of a chance of sanding too much on the edges. And if you want to be even more cautious, you can add a second soft pad. Then I went back over the corners by hand until they were to my liking. Nothing will ever be perfect, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try for it on occasion. Now for one of my favorite parts of the build, finishing. We finally get to see how this thing is going to look, but you want to be sure the surface is clean. I used compressed air to get as much dust as I can and then move on to using a towel and mineral spirits. Go over the wood a few times until your towel comes back clean, then let it dry. Now that the table is dry, I'm using Rubio Monocoat. Measuring spoons work for me, but you can use whatever you like to measure out what you need. You also don't need the activator, but I'd rather wait a week for the Rubio to cure instead of 3. Mix the two parts well for about 3 minutes, and then it's time for the big reveal. When you're using Rubio, you want to make sure it's getting down into the wood. You're going to need some white Scotch pads to work it in. You can do it by hand, but my motto is work smarter, not harder, if at all possible. And my DeWalt sander gets lonely sometimes and likes to work the wood.
How you doing?
If you have never used Rubio before, just remember, a little goes a long way. And if you happen to add too much, that's okay. You're going to wipe the excess off in about 10 minutes anyway. Yeah, I don't know how I made that all rhyme. Whether you are using Rubio or some other finishing product, you should seal both sides. If you leave one side that isn't sealed while it dries, there's a good chance you're going to have some kind of warping or cupping. The reason is, one side is now absorbing moisture from the air at a different rate than the sealed side. So always start with the underside. If any marks show up in the finish after I flip it over to do the top, it can be buffed out later when both sides have been sealed. After working the Rubio in, let it sit for about 10 minutes like I mentioned a couple minutes ago. Then come back and wipe off all the excess finish. You cannot remove too much, but you can leave too much on. Now you don't need more than one coat, hence the name Monocoat, but I learned 2 coats is better, at least for me. Not because it protects better, but because it makes it shiny. Before getting to the second coat, I use a maroon Scotch pad and lightly stain the table. I only do the top and sides though, since the second coat is just for looks, there's no need to bother with the bottom. Cleaning up after sanding is important yet again, and then I began the second coat the same way I did the first coat, making sure to record the process with the worst camera angle possible so you can't see everything. Honestly, what the heck happened to this camera? Probably not the best time to ask for subscribers, is it? Oh well. After the sander made love to the wood again, I wiped off the excess. And if you do it right, your arms will get a little workout in the process. Ooh, that could be a merch idea. I like to wait a full week for the Rubio to cure before I add the C-channels and legs. I don't know if you have to, but that's how I do it. For you small shop people, you don't need a separate room or area where something like this needs to cure. It's okay if dust and dirt get on the table. It won't mess with the Rubio finish. These screws work perfect with these inserts, just don't screw them down too tight. I like to give about a 1/4 of an inch turn extra once the screw is completely down. This should be enough to keep everything from coming loose but won't mess with any movement. The same goes for the legs, which by the way, I bought from Flowy Line Design. Anywho, I did learn one thing when I got to this point. I should have used my drilling block to make sure there was no movement in the drill bit. Some of these inserts were off just a tiny bit, so getting some of the screws in were kind of a hassle. I did finally get them all in though. For a final finish, I used a ceramic finish from Black Forest Wood Company. They recommend the top coat be reapplied every 2 years with this particular version. They have since updated their products and have one that can last up to 5 years. Blacktail Studio recently came out with a similar product, and I am looking forward to trying it out to see the difference. The only reason I used Black Forest version this time was because I still had some. I'm not going to go into crazy detail on the application, but you add a few drops on their microfiber cloth and apply it in a small 2x2 foot section. Then you wipe off the excess right after using another microfiber cloth. In about 2 to 4 hours, you can come back with a second coat. The top coat can be applied in the same time frame, but I didn't come back until the next day for the top coat. This top coat is also what you will reapply in about 2 years. Now this ceramic coating is not something you need to add to every piece of furniture if you don't want to. I just use it for things like tables that are going to get a lot of use. That's why I didn't apply it to the bottom. If you made it to the end of the video, congratulations, and thanks for watching. I used a local photographer for these photos and I thought they came out rather well. They made the table look better than anything I could do with my cheap camera, and hopefully it makes some money for the shelter. If you do happen to be in Fort Wayne, Indiana area ever and need a photographer, check out Pond Grant's Photography. A link to her page will be in the description.